Let's talk a little bit about intolerances because I think this has become more and more of a thing where you kind of I've got a friend that's a chef and he runs a kind of fine dining restaurant, and life has become increasingly more difficult for him because a table of he'll tell me the story of a table of 10 people will kind of turn up on a Saturday night, and in there's a gluten intolerance, there's a dairy intolerance, there's a histamine intolerance. And he said 10, 15 years ago as a chef, like this I wasn't dealing with this, and it's making life very, very difficult for me. Is this genuinely that there are more and more intolerances? What is kind of driving this, or is there like a hyper awareness now to symptoms and people are kind of reacting to that?
I mean, firstly, I guess for anyone listening who might not know, like a food intolerance is difficulty in digesting certain foods, and symptoms of a food intolerance can include things like stomach pain, bloating, diarrhea, flatulence, headaches, that type of thing. And this is not to be mistaken for a food allergy, which involves an autoimmune response, and symptoms are life-threatening and includes things like hives, rashes, difficulty breathing, anaphylactic shock. But food intolerances, yes, are far more common than food allergies, and it's estimated that they can affect about 20% of adults in the UK. And although they're not life-threatening, food intolerances can obviously significantly impact the quality of life of many people and people's relationship with food. So it definitely is worth getting on top of any sort of food intolerances. I think the reason we've seen a rise in food intolerances over the years is to do with how Western lifestyles affect our gut microbiota. So basically, more time spent indoors, less time in nature can have a direct impact on the gut microbes and make them less resilient to infection and intolerances. So there's also this discussion around the use of and the belief of that antibiotics could be influencing our likelihood of developing intolerances as well. And there is good evidence that the more antibiotics someone is given as a child, the more likely they are to have a food allergy or intolerance later in life, as the antibiotics can kill the healthy bacteria that colonize the gut. So the most common food intolerances we see are things like lactose intolerance, gluten intolerance, and actually something like a histamine intolerance. But I always just caution people to try to get tested for these things if possible. And lactose intolerance and gluten intolerance, well, people can get tested for lactose intolerance using a hydrogen breath test. Gluten intolerance is a little bit more difficult to diagnose. But I just always say that no one should be avoiding main food groups unless they have a confirmed diagnosis. So let's take gluten, for example. So gluten-containing foods like bread, pasta, wheat in general, they're a fantastic source of protein, fibre, B vitamins and iron. So if someone then automatically cuts those foods out of their diet, they're really missing out on a key group of nutrients. And similarly with lactose-containing foods, they're a great source of protein, calcium, those fat-soluble vitamins, so A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K. And if people cut these groups out unnecessarily, they could be putting themselves at nutritional risk.
And so if you come out with a kind of gluten intolerance, then is that and say that is like it's identified, it's actually diagnosed, right? You are intolerant to gluten. Is that a static thing where now for the rest of your life you kind of have to avoid gluten?
Not necessarily. And gluten intolerance is an interesting one because it's different to celiac disease, which is the autoimmune condition which actually causes damage to the lining of the gut when you eat gluten. But a gluten intolerance has symptoms very similar to celiac disease. But the thing with gluten is that there is still some debate as to whether it's caused by gluten itself or another protein found in wheat-based products known as fructans. And fructans forms one of the FODMAP groups, and therefore people automatically make an association that they're gluten intolerant when actually it could be the fructans they're sensitive to, which is why, for example, I use an example of a patient I had in clinic, convinced they had a gluten intolerance, self-diagnosed, avoided gluten their whole life, avoided all beer, still came to me with symptoms, and it was obvious that they were consuming a high level of fructans in their diet, which are also found in things like onion and garlic. So what we did was we removed onion and garlic for 4 weeks, symptoms completely resolved, and he was therefore then able to reintroduce gluten-containing foods, and even beer was back on the menu.